Hello, viewers. Welcome to Canada Bangladesh Social Justice Action Research Alliance. On this platform, we talk about issues that impact social justice locally and globally. The Alliance consists of a group of academics, activists, artists, writers, poets, and professionals of various backgrounds from around the world who deeply care about protecting and promoting the rights of marginalized groups. We take an active interest in social justice and equity issues. Our goal is to engage in critical conversation that initiate actions, to build global solidarity needed for social justice and make the world a more equitable, kind, and compassionate place. Today, we have with us Labiba Mazhar, a venture capitalist. We have an exciting topic for conversation today, which is let's talk about diversity in tech. So, Labiba, I know that you are a very busy professional, being a busy woman. Thank you very much for making some time for us.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me here.
So the first question that I was going to ask you is that I know that you're born in Bangladesh, and obviously we know each other for a long time. When I knew you were a high school student, now you are a professional. You were named as one of the top 50 women in Canada in fintech. So I mean, hats off to you. Your achievement is like remarkable. Wanted to know. Please tell us about your journey, and how did you from Bangladesh to where you are today in fintech? If you could tell us your journey.
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, thank you again for having me here. I watched your show before, and excited to see this kind of an initiative happening. I'd say so. As you said, I was born and raised in Bangladesh. In Bangladesh, I was lucky enough to be able to travel around the country as well. So I wasn't just kind of born and raised all the way through in Dhaka. Like I had the opportunity to grow up in other parts of the country as well, such as Khulna and Bogura. But eventually finished my high school off in Dhaka and came to Canada in Montreal to pursue my education here, my undergraduate degree. So I did double major, so two majors in finance and economics at McGill University. But throughout my education period, like I wasn't exactly sure what I wanted to do. It kind of evolved. So initially, my goal was to complete a master's and a PhD program in economics and pursue that research line. But decided eventually that was not really for me, and I wanted to pursue something more in the investments side of finance. Not really knowing that I wanted to get into venture capital. I kind of just wanted to do investments, but more for public market companies. Always had an interest in technology companies, even during those days. So after I graduated, the first couple of months I was working in a non-technical area. It was in economic development, actually. But eventually found my way into an organization where we were actually investing in a couple of financial technology startups. This is back in 2016. So back then, in Canada, at least, there were not a lot of financial technology startups or fintech startups. There were a few handful that everybody kind of knew of. But to be able to invest in financial technology startups, we just didn't find enough companies. So we decided that, okay, if there's not enough companies to invest in, then we'll just create those companies ourselves, because clearly there is a pipeline issue. So we spent a couple of years trying to build a few startups in the financial technology space, everything from personal finance management to insurance, digital banking as well. And I spent a lot of time alongside the founders of those companies in helping them with operations, project management, fundraising, special projects, and so on. So I spent 2 years at my last firm, and then saw an opportunity to join another kind of new venture capital firm that was coming together in Montreal and Toronto called Luge Capital, also focusing on financial technology, but this time we would be investing with an $85 million fund across Canada and US, helping early stage fintech startups, grow from that early stage and get into a growth stage. So yeah, I joined there 2.5 years ago, and I spend most of my time looking at investment opportunities, connecting with a lot of different founders and entrepreneurs across Canada and US, and learning about their businesses, assessing whether or not it's a good investment opportunity for us, if there's a fit. And then once we make an investment, supporting them in helping their grow their businesses. And yeah, so that's been my brief journey in fintech. It's been 4 years, and I think Canadian fintech is actually a while, just because when I started, like there were not a lot of companies, and now we're tracking more than I think 1,000 companies in Canada in fintech. So super interesting time to be in the space for sure.
Definitely, just quickly, I mean, obviously, that gives you a lot of insight into the entire ecosystem. Understanding that what's going on, what is the culture, what is the trend. Um, I'll come back to the fintech after a few questions. But one of the things that the diversity issue in tech is a well-known issue,
Yeah.
and there has been a lot of documents, research, and obviously data just tells us the hard cold fact. So how do you see the diversity issue in the tech space in Canada, America, or in North America?
Yeah, I can tell you maybe, even taking a step back from research itself, which is, as you mentioned, like there's a lot of it. Even from my personal experience, I went to McGill University, and I was very lucky because the student body there is extremely diverse. So there's lots of international students, and even amongst Canadian students, there was a lot of diversity. And so to go from that to the tech scene, which was very different. It was actually a huge kind of shock to me at first. And I remember, and actually, my mom was visiting me when I landed my first kind of tech job in Canada, and I was telling my mom, like, after my interview, oh, if I get this job, like I'm gonna have to, like figure out how I'm gonna manage my like way through this scene where it's clearly very kind of white and male dominated, or at least it was in last few years ago. So even through my personal experience, I've noticed that few years ago, there was still a visible kind of gap in the space for people from diverse backgrounds. And I think we're starting to close that gap even just a little bit. Like if I look at the tech scene today, when I go to different events, before COVID times when we were actually going to events, like the kind of people you see or meet, like they are from different kinds of backgrounds. And I think that the tech scene is a lot more accessible to people from different walks of life now than it was 5 years ago. That being said, I think there's still a lot of things that we still need to do, right? I think that certain groups of people are still massively underrepresented in senior leadership roles at technology companies. And if I look at, for example, all the companies that we are tracking in Canada and US, in even just in fintech, most companies are not being run by women or people of color and so on. So there's still a lot of gap that needs to be closed. Um, and why I think, part of the reason that it's important is because, every aspect of our lives now is becoming technologically driven, right? Starting from how you order food to where you buy your things that you need, to how you manage your finances. Like every single aspect of our lives are getting more digitally delivered, and that will continue to happen for the foreseeable future. And for example, artificial intelligence is a huge trend in technology right now for the last few years. And also in financial technology, it's a huge trend. And the promise of our artificial intelligence is basically to be able to scale decision making and services and solutions in a way that human driven businesses were not able to do that, right? And if you look at the people that are developing those kind of artificial intelligence models, you see that they're not representing the general population, right? If 50% of the population are women, for example, you're not seeing that being represented in the talent that's actually developing these AI-driven models and so on. And there's the risk that that can transfer human biases that we've had for our entire lives into these models as well. And that could become really dangerous, because now you could scale your bias that was small scaled and human driven, but now you're scaling it with AI across the entire population, which is really scary. And this can have serious impacts on people's lives. So just to maybe give you an example, for example, even looking at financial technology, there's now a lot of fintech lenders that lend money online to individuals. So they give you personal loans, you apply, and they promise to kind of fund you within a day or even less than a day, within a few hours, and so on. Um, and the promise of these fintech lenders is that we use alternative data to be able to assess the credit worthiness of a person. And this alternative data could be anything from, your spending behavior, where you live, how many times you've moved, or your educational background. So typical like data points that may not have been used in the past. But the problem with that could be that even those data points can favor certain groups of people over others because of structural issues that we've had for decades, right? And so you have to be cognizant of those risks, so that you're building your AI models in a way that it's not perpetuating the problems that already exist in terms of marginalization and lack of financial inclusion. But if I also take the other opposite view, I think technology can um, make it accessible for a lot of people to have financial services that they didn't have before. So that's the positive side of it, right? Like if a loan officer is not seeing you in person, they might not have certain biases that they would have had if they saw you in person. Maybe you were a visible minority, or maybe you have some sort of a disability, and so on, right? And maybe with technology, you're not getting those biases. So there's the good and the bad, but all this to say is that I think we have to continue the conversation of diversity and inclusion, whether that's in the workplace, whether it's the way you're building your product, and so on.
Yeah, that's a very insightful and excellent response. Also, some of the people who are actually studying in the areas of computational social science. Let's say, if I take example of a very prominent mathematician and data scientist, Kathy O'Neill, in her book, The Weapon of Math Destruction, she talks about exactly what you just have mentioned, that it's your the kind of music that you listen to can impact your mortgage rate. And
Yeah.
in the past, we have talked about redlining. Now, that postal code, if I am living predominantly in a black neighborhood, obviously,
Yeah.
and I think one of the biggest challenges, one of the biggest, giving a bit of context to our viewers here, is that I have had the opportunity of working in the fintech for about 3 years. So working with a lot of AI engineers, developers, and having a lot of conversation. And I've been super passionate about diversity and inclusion. There's something that goes on in Silicon Valley, is that the motto of the Silicon Valley is that make things, build things fast, break things, something along that line. Mark Zuckerberg has said that, right?
Yeah.
So what happens that when you build things fast, like not very fast, we are disrupting the technology. The problem comes around this decisions are made by this very powerful algorithm, but these algorithms are proprietary algorithms are nothing but human opinions written in computer in mathematical equation, right? So what we had in the past, the structural inequality or racism, we could talk about it, but now all of those things are hiding behind machine neutrality.
Yeah.
Apparently I can be denied, like what you've said. Incredibly important point is that now we have an alternative ways of actually assessing the risk, to give somebody loan. But then, what's happening? We had inequality. Yes, it has a lot of potential. I would say, I'm going to be blunt about it. I would say that, obviously in the space of fintech or in a lot of startup culture, obviously, if you're not optimistic, if you are not looking at all the potential and possibilities, you wouldn't take this immense risk to start something from scratch, build something from scratch. But I think what happens sometimes, this optimism can promote a kind of collective willful ignorance, that how, because we are training this model based on data, and the historical data has been biased, and there are plenty of evidences.
Yeah.
There was a research done in 2018 that University of Ryerson and University of Toronto, they sent out 13,000 resumes. 2018, just 2 years ago. They have sent identical resumes, just changing the names. People who had the names, sounding, foreign sounding names, had less 28%, less phone calls than the English form, European sounding names. So you and I, we both know that these resumes fast go through an algorithm, and when the algorithm parses the data, obviously in the past, white male candidates have been more successful, in terms of getting those jobs. So this is something that, scary, and something that we really need to question. Before I move on to the next question, you meet a lot of investors and people who are starting. When it comes to data governance, data literacy, or algorithmic accountability, this literacy, do you think that the way people speak enthusiastically about the new startup, do they also talk with equal enthusiasm when we need to talk about algorithmic accountability, algorithmic bias, data governance, AI governance? What have you seen in the tech space?
Yeah, I think there's definitely more of an awareness of the issues of AI, and especially black box around AI as well. And I think that there's increasing interest in figuring out a way where it's actually explainable, so that you're not just inputting historical data, and it's giving you output based on things that you don't want. Like, you don't want certain correlations in the output, but it's giving you that because the AI doesn't know that it's not a good input, for example, right? So I think that in my experience, there's definitely a lot more awareness about data governance than before. But again, like, the issue that I was just talking about, which is that the people that are building these algorithms, they need to represent in a way the mass population. That still, I think, is, we're still far from reaching that, utopian level of parity in that sense. So I think there's, I think my answer to most of these questions is we're getting there, but we're still far from that ideal state where we should be.
I think one of the things that my concern is, in terms of like the speed, like you have given a beautiful example that in 2016, just 4 years ago, when you were looking for opportunities to fund companies, there weren't enough. But now you just mentioned that you are tracking more than 1,000 fintech companies. Now, that is a huge number of companies. And to deal with that amount of data manually is just impossible. It's just impossible. And I think, and you have mentioned this already, that when it comes to automated decisions about financial and fintech, an algorithm works based on what is defined as success. Now, from the historical data, when we look at that, who have been the successful candidate in securing loan, or all the favorable outcomes of the banking system, that represents overwhelmingly the white population as opposed to the other groups of people, right? I mean, so that is something. So I think what concerns me as somebody who has been trained in critical sociology and social sciences is that at the speed how the digital technology is actually disrupting the world, are we capable of building awareness and consciousness about algorithmic bias, about data governance, about who owns that data at that speed, which is, to me, is like very, the gap is awfully big. Next question, and obviously so there was a famous article in 2015 in New York Times. It talks about glass ceiling, is that that it says that there are fewer women run big companies than men named John. This is really fascinating. And this is just 2015, right? That to what extent the men-dominated space the corporate has been, and when it comes to tech companies, I don't think it's very different. If you think about the largest tech companies, like, let's say FANG, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, Google, right? So to what extent that's going on? Have things changed? What would you say?
It's funny because we have a similar joke in the VC world as well. There are certain names that you will find people with that name in VC roles all the time. Definitely not my name. But yeah, I think that article came out a few years ago. And the latest stats that I read was that I believe there are 38 out of 500, the Fortune 500 companies, CEOs are now women, which is awesome. It's the highest that we've had ever. But at the same time, if you look at the fact that the first female CEO to be part of the Fortune 500 group was back in 1972. And so it took us almost 50 years to get to a point where still only 38 out of 500 companies are led by female CEOs, right? And so how long is it going to take us to get from here to, again, a point where it reflects the educated population, it reflects the skilled workers that are in the workforce today? Like, I don't know, but I think that it is accelerating. I would say that in the last few years, and it is, this is supported by a lot of industry initiatives as well. If I look at just the tech scene in Canada, for example, there's now a lot of initiatives, even from the government, from various organizations that are looking to support female founders, female CEOs. BDC, which is a very well-known organization in Canada, they even have a fund that's completely focused on female-led startups, right? So there are definitely initiatives that are looking to change that dynamic and change that kind of makeup of gender and backgrounds and so on, so on and such. However, I'll point to another fact is that even if you look at the Fortune 500 CEOs, out of the 38 that are women, women of color only represent, I think there are maybe 3 or 4 CEOs that are women of color. And if you look at Black CEOs, they form, I think, about 1 or less than 1% of Fortune 500 CEOs, right? And so you can look at diversity in many different angles, and diversity doesn't have to be just about women versus men. There's also intersections, which is super important and something that I find is not something that is talked about a lot, especially in the tech scene. The experience of a Black woman is not the same as the experience of a South Asian woman, or the experience is not the same as the experience of a South Asian man. So there's differences, right? And all these, large tech companies and even kind of smaller startup initiatives are focused on diversity and inclusion, which is great. But I think it's important to recognize that there's differences even within those categories, right? So maybe just to go back to your point about the glass ceiling and whether things have changed, I think things are progressing. It's still slow. I think glass ceiling is a very real phenomenon, something that people face quite a lot of work, in many different ways. But yeah, so I'll just pause there and say that, I think it's progressing, but there's still a lot of room for improvement for sure.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to gender, something that you have given a very important data that the first time we had a woman CEO was 1972. So an American, very very one of the brightest minds America has seen, James Baldwin, a Black and queer author. He's talked about something is that when we talk about change, about social changes, where one groups of people are overwhelmingly dominant socially, economically, politically. So when you talk about the changes, one of the responses that you hear, like, oh, it's going to take some time. So James Baldwin, in a very powerful statement, once says that, well, it took my grandfathers and grandmothers time, and they have been told that it takes some time. It has taken my parents' time. It has taken my entire life.
Yeah.
But how long is too long? And again, particularly tech is incredibly critical here. If you think about, right now we have over 3.5 billion people who use social media. There hasn't been a religion in the history of humanity that had 3.5 billion followers. So
Right.
If you have this tremendous network of people that are connected through tech and how it is disrupting the whole world, we're living through fourth industrial revolution. So if we are moving in that snail pace, that is scary. And particularly, I think it's very ironic, is that the first computer programmer was a woman, Ada Lovelace, came up with computer programming before computers saw its face, like 100 years ago. So it's funny that a whole field that was actually pioneered by a woman, and if you see what's happening right now, it's interesting. But speaking of
Yeah.
the gender, though, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, like one of my concerns is around this idea of diversity fatigue, right? So in the
Mhm.
last few years, like I said, like there's a lot of talk, there's been a lot of initiatives that have been taken in the industry. All these big tech companies hiring D&I officers, right? And then there's the whole thing that happened with Google and the anti-diversity manifesto and things like that. So I worry that there's too much talk still and not enough kind of moving the needle, which is basically what you're saying is like how long is too long, right? And that is
Mhm.
exactly the point is yes, we're making very slow progress, but if you look at the amount of conversation around diversity and inclusion versus intangible ways that outcomes have happened, I think there's still a huge difference, right? Like I think the tangible outcomes are happening, but the proportionately speaking, the talk about diversity and inclusion is a lot more. Um, and companies taking different initiatives for diversity and inclusion, but they're not resulting in truly moving the needle. And I think sometimes it actually does the opposite of the original intention. So yeah, I mean, I don't know the answer to how to change that necessarily, but what I do know is that even in the tech community, when I talk to startups, for example, when they are looking to hire, a VP of finance or a senior kind of leadership role, I have on a regular basis founders reaching out to me saying, "Hey, we're looking for a female candidate for this position. Unfortunately, our pipeline in terms of the female candidates was very low. If you know anybody that you can recommend to me, please let me know." Right? So there's the intent is there, but I think that organizations are not doing enough in terms of having like a full-fledged strategy that attacks the issue from multiple angles where you are able to actually have tangible outcome. Like I think that we're still not seeing a lot of tangible outcome versus the amount of budget that's being put into it.
Yeah, absolutely. Because thank you so much. You have brought something incredibly important, that is diversity fatigue. And something that I would say, in order to have true diversity, inclusion, and belonging, we should be able to have honest conversation. We should be able to have courageous conversation. Um, and I've seen, particularly in tech space, if I talk about the white folks, when, let's say, a white man talks about diversity and, oh, we should do this, we should have this. What happens, those sort of conversation buys them a lot of brownie points that, oh, this guy is so, progressive and etc. But that is performative, diversity conversation. That is not actually translating in action, right? So what happens that, when somebody in the senior position talks about those diversity thing, then people who are, I would say, at the different levels, they have their hopes high. Like, oh, the CEO is talking about diversity, or the head of HR is talking about diversity. So what happens? They get their hopes high. And now, this is something I will very, very, I'll say these sentences very advisedly, deliberately, is that when groups of people who have had their hopes dashed on a regular basis, they don't need their hopes to be dashed one more time. And
Right.
what happens is that it gets there hopes high, and they get engaged, and they start having conversation, and instead they find themselves in a even worse condition. Like, for instance, if I don't speak my mind with you, if you were my boss, you wouldn't know that what's the problem. But now you have
Yeah.
opened that opportunity of the space, like saying, oh, hey, I want to have a conversation with you. But no, just kidding. I didn't really want to have a conversation. I just wanted to talk about something that gets
Yeah.
me, a few, brownie points. But in action, you said something also that a lot of people saying, "Oh, we didn't have enough problem people and candidate," right? So tell me, when it comes to the startups, or in the disruptive space of digital domain, when the founders see, oh, this is the new technology that can get the next $1 billion, the way the founders, the community, go aggressively behind it, the way they go aggressively behind it, I wonder we have taken the same kind of seriousness in order to bring the diversity conversation, into that. So I'm very doubtful about the performative allyship. I'm very doubtful about the
Yeah.
talks, not walking the talks.
Yeah, I mean, I agree and disagree in the sense that I totally agree that what the point you're making is that when you're, constantly making a statement, but you're not following through with it, absolutely, it has probably the opposite effect because now you've made all this rah 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 about, DNI, but there's no actual outcome, right? That being said, there are people that are, that you would consider, your typical kind of, white male or whatever, but they are there are people that have taken it to be their mission, and there are ways that you can do that. So I'll give you a few examples that I've actually seen in real life. This one time, we had another partner from another VC firm come into our office. This is at my last firm, not the current one. And we were a small staff, and it's a small office. And the partner came, and I was gonna grab some water, right, for the person. And this is the typical kind of female employee behavior where you want everyone to get along, you want to bring, harmony in the community. So, it's in our nature to be like, and I'm not generalizing. I think it's common for a lot of people that you'll just want to, grab the water or say, hey, do you want some coffee or tea or whatever. But he was literally a guest in our office, but he said, no, you don't have to go. I'm gonna go. And then he went and he picked up the whole, like, box of water and took one from there. This is a small action that showed to me that I understand what you just did there. You didn't want me to be defined by my gender and my role to be defined by my gender. So you, even despite being a guest, you came in and you basically went and picked up the water yourself. So these kind of little actions definitely tell me that there are people who have been part of this quote unquote kind of privileged group or whatever, or the majority group, and they are definitely our allies. Another example, I was super lucky also at my last firm. I had a friend and colleague, white male, who basically took me aside for a couple of months into my job and handed me a book called Lean In by Sheryl Sandberg. It's a book that lots of women and men also swear by in terms of how women can tap more into their abilities and just not feel as psychologically barriered to excel in their careers. He gave me the book and he said, at my last firm, we all read this book, men, women, regardless of your backgrounds. And this is a book that I think every woman who's working in tech should read. So you read this, I'm going to give this book to you. So those for me were actions that showed that, yes, it's true that, there are people that are kind of dipping into this diversity and inclusion kind of trend that's happening right now, and they're kind of benefiting from it, showing the public that yes, my organization is taking a stance on it, but really there's no real outcome. But there are also allies who want there to be equal kind of equity for all of us, and I know that certain CEO who gave me that book also tried to hire female CTO for a year without being able to find one because there's a pipeline issue, right? That's a whole different conversation. Happy to dig into that. But yeah, like he spent an entire year not hiring a male CTO so that he could have a female kind of leadership in his tech team. So I definitely think that there are people in the world that are also like trying to help us. And we need more of that for sure. And those conscious actions so that speak louder than whatever you say,
Yeah, absolutely. And I will not at all deny that there are people who are really they walk the talk.
Yeah.
They live it. But I'll also swear by this, and is that that is an exception. Like if you say that if you get 100 male CEOs, I wonder how many of them would be able to walk the talk and exemplify by this wonderful person that you just
Right.
mentioned. Yeah. So
Right.
and so that is at the same time very hopeful. I wonder when somebody, and as I've also seen it, like for instance I've seen in the tech spaces books like Lean In to be very popular, but I just I wish that in the same tech space the books written by Dr. Sophia Noble, The Algorithm of Oppression, is that how search engine is actually consolidating the racism. I wish
Yeah.
the same is space in books like Ruha Benjamin, her work, you know uh, this sort of scholars who are it's very easy, and I've seen that in university. I'm not saying these books are not great books, like for instance White Fragility, written by Robin DiAngelo, is good. From being a white woman, she looks at white fragility, etc. But I think these books need to be read inside with other books like
Yeah.
White Rage, by Carol Anderson, or talk about Dying of Whiteness, by Jonathan Mitchell, like basically how those things are also working. So
Yeah.
it's definitely something that we need to look into it. Now, you have brought incredibly important point that there are changes, and we have seen in number that we have a lot of head of marketing or head of finance. We can see them women. I have seen one conference talk where one black woman has boldly said, and with a lot of data backed by data, is that the diversity and inclusion initiative, the way it has benefited the white women, has not benefited women of color and black women. In diversity space, one of the things that happens, that diversity gets almost synonymously used with gender. Like, well, we take diversity very seriously, but we will deal with gender.
Right.
But you think it's not that one thing you can just. It's not that you deal with one thing at a time. I'm a whole person. I'm not. You're a whole person. Just one aspect of it cannot be taken and have a meaningful
Yeah.
impact on it.
Yeah.
How do you see this?
Yeah, it's a really good point. And at in my team and personally myself as well as my team, like when we think about diversity, and especially in the context of when we're helping our startups recruit any senior leadership, or if they're looking for an independent board member and they're looking for somebody from outside, and you have kind of full reign on what kind of a person you want to bring on board. The way we look at diversity is way beyond gender, because it can be, diversity of culture, race, experience, like sexual orientation, like it can be all different kinds of things, right? And so for sure, I think that to bucket every matter kind of aspect into one big diversity bucket is absolutely the wrong approach. And I do agree with you. I think that that's kind of what has happened is people kind of went after the most important issue at hand, or not necessarily most important, sorry, the most kind of I guess the easiest issue at hand to solve, which is okay, like let's bring in more women into the tech scene. And by kind of virtue of that, like I think that has helped a lot of white women as well. I do think that there's definitely more that needs to be done for other aspects of diversity as well. Like I think queer diversity, for example, like in the tech scene, like they're not very well represented, right? Like the LGBTQ community is not very well represented in the tech scene, and I think there's a lot more that needs to be done there as well. So I think to bucket everyone into one group and then have some groups benefit more than others, like I don't think that is the that is the heart or the spirit of what diversity is supposed to mean. But I think you're right. Like even if you look at the pay gap kind of statistics in the US, from as far as I can recall, we often talk about the pay gap between men and women, but even within women, the pay gap is varies a lot. So there's considerable gap between white women and Asian American women's pay versus Latin American women, or Black women or Native American women. So there's definitely pay gap that exists, even, and that's just an example of how there's gap even within different groups of minority, right? So yeah, I think that that is an issue that's you're doing a great job bringing it to the front, because I think that's something that needs to be at the back of our heads as we design as organizations design diversity and inclusion strategies, that no two groups are the same, and each group's experiences are very different. And when you're designing a strategy, you need to keep that in mind in terms of all the different kind of groups within minority groups that exist, and that the strategy needs to be different for each of them.
Yeah, absolutely. I love the way you phrased it. Is that basically how we actually understand diversity and intersectional
Yeah.
an approach is incredibly important to look at it. Um, and particularly being in Canada, you and I, we both live in Canada, and we are in so many ways part of Canada. In many ways. But also, I think we need to take a hard look at in our reality. We need to understand that we live in a land that was, stolen from the indigenous people. We are living on a land that was built on despicable, unimaginable brutality, terminating 98% killing. I'm sorry, I don't mean to talk about the word film Terminator. It's like literally 98% indigenous people have been, murdered by the European settlers. Like, when you and I would grow up, we read, oh, Columbus, the discoverer and all of that, but we don't know about that history. Now, how is it connected to technology? Uh, in in tech space, I have seen the least represented people. I've done a research on that, are indigenous people, and I think what we're doing is that, in some ways, obviously, given that the indigenous people, the person is a population, that is something they're going to consider. But I feel like when the world is getting massively disrupted by artificial intelligence, machine learning, where like McKinsey has predicted, but within next 10 years, by 2030, one third of the global jobs can be automated. One third. Like, in 2016, University of Oxford and Central Bank of the UK, they have looked at what can happen in the United States, that almost as many as 87 million jobs can be automated. So we need to understand that this is real. This is not, I think it's Arthur C. Clarke. I'm not sure who is the author who talked about, science fiction author, who talked about is that the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed. So I looked into the data about the indigenous people in the tech, and what I found was very disheartening. If I may pull it up, it's so I looked at the data about the indigenous people. It says that in Google in 2019, 0.8% people, and this is, by the way, the data pulled from the Google website, diversity website data. Apple, 1%. Amazon, 0.7%. Airbnb, 0.24%. Microsoft, 0.2%. Now, have you noticed that these are the least represented people? Now, if the world, if I'm allowed to take you for a second to the film Matrix, is that if the world that is becoming so fast, mediated by artificial intelligence, machine learning, if algorithm find its way from Hollywood fiction to our real life, where it makes a decision from whether I get a loan or not, even to the extent that what is my prison sentence, length.
Yeah.
Like, you and I can talk about the fresh wound, like, where in Wisconsin, a black man was shot 7 times at the back, where a 17-year-old man, can wield, a gun and shoot multiple people and can just, nothing happens, right? So,
Yeah.
mind you, when an algorithm that is deciding the recidivism risk, what is the risk of me committing the same crime, being a person, I say it from perspective of a parent. I am a father, and I have a son who has a very unmistakable Muslim name. My kid is brown. So when I think about, not only as an educator or a researcher, somebody who has worked in, fintech, somebody who looks at these things critically, understanding what's the implication. We have already had conversations about facial recognition technology. You will go through the airport and arbitrarily, oh, Laviba, can I have an extra conversation with you? Oh, well,
Yeah.
you have been arbitrarily picked, like randomly picked, right?
Yeah.
So what is that data that is feeding? Like, the moment, you and I also know, this looks separate, but they're very connected. Like on WestJet, somebody was speaking Arabic, and people felt uncomfortable because somebody was speaking Arabic, and they were let off the plane. So
I remember that. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's not mistake that at all. So the data that is being used to train this powerful algorithm, and if these people are pushed to the margin, if they're not brought in the center, this authoritative algorithm is going to disrupt our life in ways, and we will face consequences that is worse than our worst nightmare, perhaps, in some ways. Now, you mentioned something about pipeline problem, right? Now, we all know, we maybe don't want to say it, is that in tech, the bro culture, right?
Yeah.
Do I? So what are the other expressions? And we have talked about it. The programmers, right? It's like, hey bro, so
Yeah.
that's sort of like toxic programmer culture. And the anti-diversity manifesto that was, and the book that I was reading by Sophia Noble, the algorithm of oppression, what it boggled my mind is that, so in the beginning, the author says, just write in the Google search engine, Black women should, and see what are the autofill suggestions that come. If you just randomly Google, just write educated men, that's it. That's it. And see, and go to the Google image. I wonder how many of those pictures are going to be a Black man or an indigenous woman or a brown woman from, India. So these are real phenomena, right? So there's a fascinating book. It's called the Googleization of everything. Everything's becoming Google. You have gone through university system. I've gone through university system, right? So in the university where we learn things, we learn to think critically. Our professors challenge our ideas, and that's where we appreciate disagreement, right? Have you noticed that how increasingly we are becoming dependent on Google, and not only depending on search engine? A very few of us actually have that critical consciousness or the data literacy or understanding how the algorithm works, to question, challenge, doubt the outcome of a Google search, right? So what's happening, we are experiencing a thing called digital gentrification. When I search something, out of 70 million, results, the first 12, and let's not forget let's not forget Google Ads. Like, a lot of those results come, based on have you paid for that keyword, right? So that is true. So in terms of that reality, that's how fast things are changing. We rely and believe on Google's search results so much, where anybody can write anything. We are not able to critically analyze the source. Where did it come from, right? In a library system, you cannot prioritize this book over that book. That's it. But when you search something in Google, that is very much what did the algorithm brought on the top, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So how do you see the culture problem and the pipeline problem?
Yeah, I think it's a question that I actually think about often. And it basically came from, when I was trying to either hire junior analysts or interns, even in VC roles, I would see that although it's a very kind of sought after kind of role, the pipeline is very much not representative, again, of the population or even the educated population, right? Like I've seen posts from other firms when they're trying to hire, and they're making these kind of, they're sending me messages saying, hey, we're looking for candidates with diverse backgrounds. We don't have enough. Can you please help us spread the word? I personally think there's both. Like, I don't think it's either pipeline issue or a culture issue. I think it's a combination of both. From a pipeline perspective, I think that throughout the education and work career of an individual, I think there's leakage in the pipeline. So if you look at the number of students that are entering at, in primary or secondary education, and the diversity in that population, it's a lot, in my opinion, it's a lot better of diversity compared to, those that are subsequently enrolling into STEM programs, right, in university or college, and then subsequently entering the workforce. I think there's leakage along the way, and a lot of it, it's a complex kind of set of factors that contribute to that. I think, part of it is certain groups of people might feel like they don't have, for example, enough role models in those areas, right? So I know for a fact, for example, when I was entering the VC world, there were only a handful of kind of female managing partners, for example. And by managing partners, I mean these are like the top decision makers within venture capital firms. That are ultimately making the investment kind of go or no go decisions. And so for me to say, it's not something that I maybe thought consciously, but subconsciously I might have thought, oh, there's not enough female role models in this space, right? And so and then female and person of color, forget about it. Like that just is very, very rare. Like it doesn't exist. And so I think there is a pipeline issue, and part of it is because you don't see enough role models that have kind of progressed their career there, and that's where kind of the glass ceiling comes in as well. I think the society kind of also is designed in a way that discourages a lot of people to kind of follow through in certain paths, and they kind of leak through the pipeline. But there's also other issues, like when companies advertise, especially tech startups and tech companies, when they advertise jobs, a lot of startups, like they use language in their job postings that are, they fundamentally discourage certain groups of people. So one, for example, like, rock star or ninja, like these are words that are known to discourage certain groups of
Yeah.
people, like women, from applying, right? And you and I both know that there have been studies that show that women only apply for jobs when they meet 100% of the criteria for the requirements of the job. Whereas, and again, this obviously generalizes. That's the issue with studies, but compared to that, men apply a lot more frequently. Like even if they don't meet 100% of the requirement, I don't remember the exact percentage of requirements they meet, but I think it was around 50. So there's a huge gap, and part of that comes from how we're just different. Women are different from men are different from women, like and no matter how much you ask us to lean in, like we're fundamentally different people, right? And so all this to say is that I think companies could do a better job, like tech startups could do a better job in the way they design their job postings as well, the way they design their recruitment strategy, right? Like the example that I was giving you earlier, that I have CEOs reaching out to me saying we're looking for a VP of this or C-levels executive for this. Like, do you know any women that you could refer, because we don't have enough in our pipeline? So those kind of initiatives are great, and I think that needs to continue even more. But your other point, which is around culture, like that is also a huge deterrent. Like there's a study that was done called Tech Leavers, by the Kapor Center, that looked at people that left their last job in the tech space, and a big part of the response was unfairness at work, unfair treatment at work, like stereotyping, for example. There were other aspects as well, but bullying, microaggressions, stereotyping, and people are, according to that study, like people were twice as likely to leave their job because of unfair treatment, like being passed over for promotion or stereotyping, and like I said, compared to being recruited away by a new job, right? And this is costing. Not only does it cost, not only does it create kind of mental and physical issues for the employees, and then it creates like overall kind of discontent and can affect your productivity for sure. And it's costing companies a lot of money too, right? Like to replace that person, to recruit that person, and forget about the reputational damage. Like lately there have been so many stories of sexual harassment in tech, for example. And but anyway, so all this to say is I think there's both the pipeline issue and there is a culture issue. So again, I go back to this idea of attacking it from multiple sides, so that you're not just adopting one strategy that kind of falls flat and doesn't really work out.
I think you have included an incredibly important point. It's about the language. I was having a conversation with somebody who is in tech space, an incredibly gifted programmer. I think I should say programmer. So we were having a conversation that somebody once has written. So somebody has once used in their marketing campaign the word mofo, and you and I both know what that means, right?
Yeah.
So somebody has written is that, hey, I did you hear me?
No, I got disconnected for a bit. I don't know if it was me or if it was you.
Okay. Sorry, I will
Sorry about that.
No worries. Yeah. So what happened that I was having a conversation. So I wanted to understand, in bro culture, in bro grammar culture, in tech spaces, that the use of language. So somebody was very adamant using the word. Oh, it's okay to use the word mofo, right? So somebody else responded. A woman responded by saying, as a survivor, when these two words are strung together, it brings in memory that impacts my mental health. And besides, I'm a mother and I have a daughter. So, but what was interesting is that to what extent our ignorance can be there. So when you mentioned about also language, right? Think about the language that ninja, rockstar, right? A lot of the languages, also try to. I think these are different versions of quote unquote confidence, representing words. Like,
Mm.
for example, think about it that we are socialized. We men are socialized from very early in our life to be, loud, noisy, boisterous in so many ways, and we're allowed to do that, right? But then our ability to articulate, our ability to speak loudly and being like, yeah, do you understand? So that gets perceived as confidence. But I
Yes.
think we are still hung over by this confidence, addiction. But you see, confidence is very different from competence. Competence is something that we prove every day. It's not about, it's like
Yeah.
how many people that I can rouse and rile up and like, yes, let's do, and all of that. That's very much like, male centric, performative, toxic masculine in many, many ways, kind of, performative things, right? So language, is incredibly important. So in a case like that, given our discussion that we have, and what do you think is our current state of diversity, and what are some of the common initiatives that have been taken to address and tackle this?
Yeah, so I can tell you some initiatives that I see in my kind of day in day out job, because that's the what I'm closest to. So startups. One of the ways that they're looking to increase and improve the diversity of their senior leadership is by, for example, looking for a board member on their board that would be not your typical kind of. If you look at startup boards today, most of them are again kind of male and white, and part of that reason is because, or at least in my experience, that's what I've seen. Part of that is because when you look at a startup board, it's usually comprised of the investors, the senior management of a startup, and occasionally you'll have an independent board member, right? And CEOs or senior leadership in startups are often not diverse. Same with the kind of decision maker level investors within their investment firms. So again, you're putting all the kind of your usual suspects that you would see like 10 years ago. They're still the kind of people that you're seeing today. And then the startup will say, now what I'm seeing more and more is startups founders are consciously thinking of how can I improve the diversity of my board. And I actually wrote a blog about this, even at Luge, about this idea of improving diversity in your board. The challenge with that, and I know it's going a bit off topic, but the challenge with that is that startups, when they're looking to hire independent board members, they're often looking for somebody who, now they're growing their board size, right? So now they're looking for people that can bring certain skill sets to their board, right? And part of that skill set could be, for example, previous board experience. But because women have had this kind of glass ceiling, or not just women, but different minority groups as well, have had glass ceilings around them, they have not historically, most of them have not historically held board seats, right? They need to start somewhere, right? So if you're looking to hire someone with 20 years of senior leadership experience at a bank, chances are you going to find a woman? No. Are you going to find a person of color or from the LGBTQ community? No. So that plays a. So what ends up happening is that these startups, like, they go with the intention of finding someone to bring diversity, but then they will end up with not finding somebody, or they're not going to prioritize it, because the reality of it is that you're trying to build a startup. You might not make payroll next week, right? You might not be able to pay your employees next week. So the real life of the business kicks in, and then these kind of more long-term initiatives or strategic initiatives, they kind of take a backseat. That's just the unfortunate reality of it. The other initiative is obviously, as I mentioned to you, like more and more kind of VC firms or just funds, impact funds, or like investment firms that are launching with the idea of targeting specifically underrepresented groups in terms of founders. And I think that's excellent. Definitely a step in the right direction. But again, there's challenges there as well because of that pipeline issue, right? Like I have friends who run these kind of funds that are more targeted towards underrepresented groups. And the challenge is that I'm telling you that I have 1,000 companies in my pipeline. They might have 100 companies in their pipeline, right? Because even if I look at our like pipeline of companies, only a small percentage are run by women. If you look at maybe visible minority groups, it's probably a lot more. But if I just narrow in on that, like female leadership, like that's a very small percentage. And so how do you, even if you have $100 million fund to invest in start founders, how do you find those founders that are, coming from those backgrounds and building businesses that will return the capital? Like it's so complicated, So again, I think the signaling is there. So these funds launching, it's encouraging for these minority groups to start companies, take that risk, which they might not have had, right? Like as an immigrant, I might not feel that I have that ability to quit my full-time job today and build a startup with no kind of income or whatever, right? But for somebody else, it might have been a lot easier because maybe they had that footing. And whatnot. So I think that these kind of initiatives are definitely encouraging more people to take the initiative and take the risk and start a company. But I believe that, again, uh, we still have so much to do. Like we still have so much to do. We still have to be cognizant of the fact that diversity fatigue is happening, and that we cannot let that discourage us from making actual and real kind of changes. Like I think there's still so much of the needle needs to be moved, and that's still not happening. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the challenges that I find in diversity is that in order to have a very courageous and honest conversation, we first need to build that trust. But I think it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of an insight. And what you just have mentioned, that pipeline problem, right? So just think about it. Like, for example, when companies hire, and again, it's in the advertisement, it's in the interview language, is that, are you fit for the culture, right? Now think about it. When you hire for the culture fit, and if it is dominantly one particular culture, you will look for attributes, you will look for qualities in a person which is comfortable, because difference is not comfortable. When we sit across somebody who sound different, who talk different, who have different worldview than us, obviously one thing that we often, I often quote Carl Sagan, one of his most remarkable comments is that we can only measure our progress by the courage of our question and the depth of our answer, of the questions, not in the comfort of what we know, right? So how do you balance it? Like, if we hire for culture fit, it's like, okay, echo chamber, or we should hire for cultural diversity. How do you do that?
Yeah, it's tough, right? Because especially, I live in the world of startups, and I'll tell you, for example, our team, we have only 5 people in the team because VC firms, they're, typically small. And even within that, we have incredible diversity from race to, we're from gender, race, experience of growing up in different parts of the world, and so on and so forth. You can, feel free to take a look at our website. Like you'll see right away what I mean. And I think that culture fit is definitely important in small startups, right? Because and I live in that small startup world, so that's what I can speak for the most. When you have a team of 15 people or 10 people, some engineers, some finance people, business people, whatever, like that fit is super important, so that everybody gets along, and that even if there is conflict, that there's a way to resolve that, and so on. But at the same time, I think the diversity and inclusion kind of mandate has to come from the top. Like, I think that no matter how much you talk about it at the more mid or junior level, the language and the initiatives and that stance, has to come from senior leadership, and it has to be kind of baked into every single thing, not just say, hey, we're going to have a lunch and learn about unconscious bias, and we're going to talk about what unconscious biases you might have, right? Because 30 years of biases that we've built up, and all of us have biases. Like, just because you and I are people of color doesn't mean we don't have biases. We all do, in different ways, right? And so an hour-long lunch and learn workshop is not going to change that. And in fact, there's some articles that talk about how it could even have the counter effect, where you're more conscious of it now, and that you're still doing it. That's even worse, in my opinion. So I think that the initiative has to be a lot deeper than having one lunch and learn, or one kind of session where you talk about Bangladesh because one employee is from Bangladesh. That stuff doesn't work, in my opinion. Like, I think it has to be a lot more than that, and that initiative has to come from senior leadership. But yeah, so to go back to your point about whether or not it should be hire for diversity or whether it's culture, I think you have to hire for diversity, of course, but you cannot just hire for diversity and put them in an organization that just has a culture that deflects diversity. Like, it has to be like a two-pronged approach, so that you're hiring people that are bringing more diversity to your organization, no matter what kind of diversity it is, but that they're able to survive, and they're able to thrive in an environment that welcomes that diversity and not just kind of alienates them because they're different.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's an incredibly important point you have brought about. Is having I think it's one of the most popular initiatives taken by companies, to promote their diversity and inclusion. That, hey, we have unconscious bias workshop for an hour, right?
Yeah.
And you're right. Is that you and I can be person of color. I think my understanding of bias, was one of the best place to understanding bias is actually artificial intelligence. Is actually from algorithm. You see, ask anybody who is in AI and algorithm, is that they work based on approximation, not exact accurate understanding. So you see, you and I, we go through the world through approximation. We look at the world through biases, because if we didn't look at the world through biases, if we didn't operate on assumption, in that case, our brain doesn't have the capacity to understand, deconstruct everything, and we wouldn't be able to operate.
Yeah.
My question is that when we start questioning our assumption, we go into this space of discomfort, because we, in the evolutionary process, I'm very careful about talking about the evolutionary biological things as well, because that also gets used as an excuse, like, well, this is how human beings have evolved. What can I do? I am I have evolved to be a horrible person, right? So that's how it is, right? So I'm careful about it. So when we are uncomfortable going into space of unknown, it creates anxiety in us, and that's why we don't want to be challenged in our assumption, right? So one of our Boro Bhai, big brother from Toronto, has brought a very important point here, is that Imamul Bhai, is that understanding diversity is very important. Thanks for bringing different aspects of diversity issue. And Imamul Bhai is very established, and also a prominent person in radio, and having this conversations too. Diversity needs to be understood, particularly our experience. And you and I can speak to this one commonality, because you and I are both from Bangladesh, and we both are settled in Canada, and this important conversations needs to be had, right? So I think that unconscious bias workshop for an hour doesn't do. Like just one day, hey Lafiba, bring some chotputi and samosa at workplace, and and I have shared samosa. Awesome, I enjoyed it, right? But isn't there an English sentence that says that put your mouth where your money is, right? Isn't there a sentence like that?
Yeah. Put your money where your mouth is, I think.
Exactly. Put your money where your money is.
Yeah, I think.
Something along
Yeah,
that line.
exactly.
So I think that would be something that
Yeah, for sure.
we can look forward to. Lavia, I know that you are a very busy person, and giving us some time, it means a lot to us. And this conversation needs to continue. This is the first conversation we have had about specifically geared towards diversity in tech, particularly as tech is disrupting our world faster than, I'm sure that you've heard this conversation that we live in an exponential time. What used to happen in a century in the past, that happens in a few years now. So
yeah,
we need to really boost the diversity discussion so that, we build a world that is inclusive and more compassionate. Thank you very much for coming on and, giving us some time.
Thank you for the initiative and spreading the word about this, to your audience. I think that's really, really important. And thank you for having me. It was a great conversation.
Yeah, and we have learned to learn from you, and we look forward to future conversation. And audience, thank you very much for being with us. If you have any question, throw us an email or leave a comment. Have a wonderful day in Canada and evening in Bangladesh. Bye-bye.
Bye.